Okay, we have our next speaker, Francis Parr, who's the convener of our working group on ACTUS standards and an incredible talent who we're thrilled to have working as part of our team. And he's going to talk about the risk interface, which enables the ACTUS standards to interplay with the models of risk. So in fact, you can do serious and high quality risk analytics. Francis, please. And don't hit that button because that's the one that turned off the screen.
That, and you probably turned it on with the other one. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So Alan did a tremendous job in the previous presentation of explaining how what ACTUS is, what the ACTUS standard is, how it standardizes contract specifications. Now, my job at working with ACTUS and the ACTUS Financial Research Foundation is to try to provide the things that make ACTUS usable and easy for people to embed in their solutions. And a key part of that is having an interface to risk models. As Alan explained, contracts can be standardized. They're very fixed. That's what ACTUS does. But risk models are incredibly complicated, and you need many different ones. And users have to come with their own risk models. That's the way that you make ACTUS usable. And the trick to do this, in a way, is not to standardize risk models. That will never work. You won't have the right risk models when you use them, but to have a standard interface to risk models, which enables anyone to plug their risk modeling and use ACTUS simulation of contracts underneath it. That's a key step forward. And what I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes is a proposed interface, which would become an extension of the ACTUS standard. It wouldn't change contract definitions. It wouldn't change terms. All that stays exactly as it is. But it says, if you want to plug your risk model into ACTUS simulation of the contracts, here's the interface. This is what you have to add to your risk model, then everything will work. That's incredibly important in enabling people who want to build analytic solutions to use ACTUS contracts and ACTUS contract simulation as a core part of that solution. So that's right, that went on here. So a very quick outline. ACTUS enables the separation of algorithmic cash flows from risk models. That's what we talk about. Contracts are public and shared and very well defined. Risk models are subjective, they're complex, they're competitive. People build different models. Those are never going to be open. Those are never going to be freely shared. I mean, there could be some open ones, but the best ones will be private. And so ACTUS has evolved. There was an initial standard in the data dictionary, perhaps almost 5 years old now, and a reference implementation available as free open source code on Java, on GitHub. And one of the things we did, I became very actively involved in as part of proposals to the FDIC in 2020 and 2021, evolving that and showing that we could take data from a relatively small bank and convert it into ACTUS contracts and run it through this open source public simulation software. We evolved that and to have developed cloud demonstrations showing how you can explore ACTUS and say, how do I make this portfolio of contracts? How do I see how it behaves under different risk models? You can select the risk scenario and see that the contracts actually produce different cash flows in different ways. And also we componentized ACTUS so that you can make, you can have an easy to deploy componentized solution. So a very important principle is how do we really support the principle that ACTUS contract simulation and portfolio simulation works with anyone's risk model and show this is how you actually connect them up. And this would be a major step in a world where people build scalable componentized solutions. You could then plug in the ACTUS contract and portfolio simulation as a component within such a solution. And the key step, which we're proposing, the work group that I convene has evolved, is this specification of here's a risk API, which would give ACTUS this capability. So, and this goes forward, that's right. So what does ACTUS provide you today? It's easier to point, this is the diagram. You have a user application. It presents a request. Here's my portfolio, a set of ACTUS contracts. Here is, typically this is market risk factor data today that you're using. Here is how I think interest rates are going to move. Here is how I think stock prices are going to move. And that flows into the ACTUS reference implementation server that does the contract simulation, generates a whole collection of contract cash flow events, one for every contract, and feeds it back. So this is user requests the simulation of a portfolio, passes the market interest rates and the time series that are projected, and the response is the results that you get out. All of the cash flows that you need, which will be the basis for an analysis. Okay, so now, in addition to having, that hasn't gone forward. Oh, that went forward too, there we are. In addition to having projections of market interest rates and prices, which affect the behavior of all contracts, which reset, and this is key to interest rate risk, as we talked about, you need to have a model, you need to model the behavior of individual contracts. There are properties like prepayment, there are properties like default, there are properties like exercise of an American option, which will depend on many things. What's the state of the market? What are the current interest rates and prices? What's the state of the contract? How much time until it matures? And what are the non-ACTUS attributes of the contract? What's its credit rating of its counterparty? Which industry is it in? Is that industry in an upturn or a downturn? And so on. All of those are risk factors that go into your risk model. In general, they're not ACTUS terms, these are all important and useful models, industrial strength models used by banks and financial institutions today. For each of these properties, like default, like prepayment, like exercise, probably use tens of parameters, and they're really complicated and sophisticated. Those are the things that will be competitive and proprietary and won't get standardized. But how do we connect those things to an ACTUS simulation? Now, we started on that issue with the FDIC work. Actually, we demonstrated 4 or 5 years ago to the FDIC that we could take a very simple, a 2-parameter model of prepayment and plug it in. And we had this very simple sample model, a toy model, not an industrial strength model, but a toy model. And we plugged it in. And indeed, if you read the ACTUS technical specification very carefully, there is something called a risk call-out. Every time it wants to know, did this contract prepay at this point in simulation time? It calls out on a schedule and says, did it fail or not? And you can look up, in our toy examples, it looks up in a simple surface and it says, well, given the current interest rate and the market rate, if they refinance, here is whether it prepaid or not. So there was a simple way in this implementation of attaching demonstration risk models and have it actually work with this. So you would do the same thing. You'd set up with some calls here, this model. And in this way, we have had around for a while. And in fact, some of the demonstrations that we use a version of the ACTUS reference implementation, which does allow this embedded risk model. But this is really not a good way to proceed. If you think about it, if you want this risk model is built as part an interface here so that each time risk information is needed, the ACTUS simulation calls out to the risk service and says, did a prepayment happen at this point? Did a default happen at this point? If you have climate risk, did a climate event happen at this point in time, which creates a danger and could change the behavior of this contract? And each time, these two things are interacting across a well-defined API, and the contract simulation knows exactly what to do. So there's no sensitivity in any of this blue code to anything that's going on in here. It's just able to ask questions about risk modeling and get back answers. Okay? And then finally, when the results are returned, we return them here. So if I turn that on its side, we can look at the next diagram. So this is the old diagram, but now we've done exactly what we wanted. We've moved the pink risk model and made it a totally independent model and moved it outside and made it an independent component that works in a scalable solution constructed out of components. And we have it work here. And there's a well-defined API which explains how it will interact with ACTUS. So then, if we want to look at the collection, so interestingly, we don't have a step one. We're not attempting to standardize the relationship of the user with our risk service model. That's not an issue, okay? Because that will be specific to each risk service. Then there are a few extra commands in here, some very simple extensions of the way ACTUS requests a portfolio simulation, initialize a job, a sequence of analyses, initialize an analysis, set up the portfolio, start the analysis. Here are the critical interactions. And the most special one here is the risk observer event, which is what happens when the ACTUS contract simulator has to call out and say, did something happen at this point in simulation time? And it gets back a definitive answer. And what it calls out when it does this is simple ACTUS contract state. What's the current interest rate? What's the current notional? Is there any accrued interest at this point in time? What are the details? And the other terms of the contract have been passed to the risk service before. So that's all available. And then finally, the results go back. So this then is a proposed extension of the ACTUS standard. Doesn't change the contracts, doesn't change the contract terms. If you stabilize this set of 7 or 8 commands and you tell any risk service, all you have to do now is implement an API that will deal with these requests from the ACTUS service. And at that point, we've really established that ACTUS contract portfolio simulation can work with any risk service and make that much easier for a commercial user to do. So there is a specification of exactly what's on in all of these steps. That's available publicly. We've worked through it. I'm expecting in the next few months to go to the ACTUS board and try to get that made part of the standard. And we'll expect to have some sort of, I've done some prototyping. We've done some prototyping of the initial mechanisms for each of these interactions. So hopefully we can have an open Java implementation of that. For a very simple, we will now have an external toy risk service model with 2 parameter models of default and whatever, but now interacting through this interface with the proper ACTUS service. And anyone who wants to interface another real value add working thing can expect to use that. So this is part of an overall series. I guess I've been entirely working on this slide. Essentially, we've been working forward to try to remove the obstacles that make ACTUS, that appear to be obstacles that could make it slower for people to adopt ACTUS and use it in real working solutions as a technology using the open source code. In 2021, we showed with a very small team that we were able to map a sample bank's portfolio, a very simple bank, into ACTUS. In 2022, we showed in a demonstration, this was the first easily visible demonstration, that you can take an ACTUS portfolio and you can run it against different risk scenarios and see the different cash flow results of different risk scenarios. We've Dockerized the ACTUS server so that you can have different versions of Java and you can easily install ACTUS component by component. Well, it's the ACTUS server comes as one component, but user applications can be a separate component, and a persistent data store database can be in a third component. We did some initialized risk modeling, just showing how you do risk modeling, but that was the model with the risk model built inside the ACTUS component. And we've, at the end of last year, we actually evolved the ACTUS reference implementation and the contracts. We added in a new boundary controlled switch contract type that enables us to do with barrier contracts, an interesting, fairly broad class of contracts and options. So we're evolving and getting out new releases of the ACTUS contract implementation that all work inside this solution. And then this next step is to show the risk factor API. Reorganizing this, in my mind, will truly make clear this is the steps you go down. If you have an existing solution and want to start using ACTUS as a component with that, how you adapt to the risk models that you have today. So then there we go. So how is that? How might that be used? So typically, the way we expect ACTUS to be used in practice is that you have an existing financial organization. It has its operational systems. Those are finely tuned. Those are very high value. Nobody's going to change that. So ACTUS is always likely to be used as an add-on. Can I pull out some data? Can I do some regular periodic mapping of the contracts that are in this organization and get an ACTUS version and have some new and additional analytics that come out of that? What are the most likely contexts in which that will occur? Here's a typical modern bank. Alan mentioned this, highly silo-oriented, many different silos. And maybe there will be value in being able, each of these uses typically completely independent, separate, different risk modeling services. So if you want a corporate view that you're going to pull out from each of these operational silos for different departments, trading and mortgages and banking and so on, and investment banking, you may pull out everything as ACTUS contracts. And then perhaps you want to be able to show that you can do risk modeling in those ACTUS contracts that's compatible with this, and maybe add an additional corporate view of what is the bank-wise exposure to individual companies and so on. There's a regulatory, do I have to point that this way? Yes. There we go. There's a regulatory view. If you have supervised smaller financial institutions, maybe if you lean on what's provided as relatively de facto standard core processing views, you can map the holdings into ACTUS as to some extent as we did with the original P-Bank example. Then you may have very low cost to the supervised financial institution, an ACTUS view, and maybe regulators can do a pull on that. Maybe regulators have one set of risk models for things they want to do. Maybe they model risk to multiple banks at once, which would be true systemic risk model. And maybe they require, typically the small bank may get some good forward-looking analysis out of this, and they may choose to share or not to share those risk models with the regulator. The regulator may require them to run a particular risk model. So all of those things happen. And a final page, I think. So essentially, ACTUS-based risk analytics, we're arguing that by having this external risk API, we can have compatibility with existing banking operations. Take the proprietary value and risk modeling that you have. Here's how to connect it to ACTUS contract simulation. Makes it much more practical. There are interested, the ACTUS standard representation of contracts is in fact very consistent and helps support buy-in banking industry architecture. Guy Rackham is going to talk about that later today. That may be another way that we're relevant to banking. Regulatory, we can open the chance of forward-looking risk analysis by small banks, for small banks, and by the regulator. Forward-looking analysis, make it more automated, more straightforward. There are scalability. Some of the things that we put into this proposed risk API help with scalability. The previous ACTUS version said, oh, you have to pass all of the market risk data that you're using in the simulation request the API, the interface we're proposing generalizes that and allows that, but opens up more efficient ways of moving large amounts of data. With this, it's possible also to move forward and start thinking about machine learning and AI techniques in a scalable solution using this external risk API. Very good. Thank you very much. I probably don't have time for a question because I think we're on a bit. If you allow time for a question, I could wait for one. Yes.
Would you go to slide 10?
I could go. That's a may or may not be a challenge, but let's. That's back one or two.
One more.
One more. Okay.
There we go. So you're breaking down front, middle, and back office. Could you explain where ACTUS breaks down into those functions and what?
It's all of these. All of these offices are all of these levels of analysis are dealing with the same underlying contract holdings. Each department has contracts that it's holding. The analysis that you do in each of these levels may be specialized and different.
If you apply ACTUS.
Whether or not you apply ACTUS. ACTUS means that if it's not only true that each of these departments have their own risk models, but within each department, there are different risk analyses performed by this business line management and this counterparty data and so on. So the point is, it's trying to emphasize risk modeling is very complex and very fragmented. So extremely important to show that ACTUS doesn't care. If you have your contracts in ACTUS, you can have as granular risk modeling as you want.
Applied across all three.
Applied
Yeah.
up and down and
Yeah.
across.
And then the next question, of course, is: have you ever run cost-saving models on the application of ACTUS in all three contracts?
Okay. To do that effectively, we need good sample data to work from that enables us to do realistic and helpful. So if you're part of a financial institution that's happy to work with us and help construct that data, I've now taken more than my time, and I think Alan probably wants to